submitting to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh to them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to win their favour, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Those who do wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven.
Thank you, Jen. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all doing well and wide awake still. So my first thought when I read this passage was that it does contain one of the more controversial and challenging verses to preach on in the Bible. And so I thought, yay, I love a challenge. No, I didn't. My first thought was, I'm very sorry, but I think I'm going to be away in Cape Town / Singapore / Hawaii that particular Sunday. And then I imagined Andy, my husband, sitting in the front row smirking while I tried to preach on, wives, submit to your husbands. I'm just joking, by the way, he wouldn't do that. We never usually manage to get here early enough to sit in the front row. I'm actually going to jump ahead and tell you my conclusion first. And that is that the whole of this passage is really about us all having a servant heart towards one another, as Christ showed his servant heart to us when he sacrificed himself for the church and he died on the cross for us, to serve us and to save us. And if we approach this passage with servant hearts like Jesus, that influences how we might interpret and understand these verses. And that is absolutely key. All of these verses tie in together regarding instructions for Christian households. And they're about how our families and households should function together as a unit, with different members having different roles and responsibilities within the household. Now, your household might consist of you. You might be the whole of your household. But don't be put off that the first few verses seem to be just addressing a family, because I think that they have a relevance to everyone as general instructions for how we should treat and get along with one another. So please bear with me and listen still. And please don't assume that individual verses don't apply to you. I like that the most challenging verse to preach on is right at the beginning, so it's not looming over us as I talk about other things. Verse 18, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Why is this a controversial and difficult verse? I mean, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? We live in 2022, not in 50 AD. It has taken many decades and great sacrifices for women to achieve the more equal footing with men that we have nowadays. Although we still see gender pay gaps and unfair discrimination in many circumstances. How does this verse tie in to our generation? Does it apply to our generation? First, we should recognise that this verse is emotive for many of us, as in we have an emotional response to it, and that may not be a positive one, and for a variety of reasons. And it can be emotive for men as well as women. What is absolutely crucial to interpreting this verse and the rest of the verses in today's passage is recognising who it is addressing. It's addressed to wives. Husbands, this verse isn't for you. Just as the next verse is addressed to husbands, not wives. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. What verse 18 is not? It is not an instruction to husbands. And it is not ever an excuse or justification for abuse. Neither does it mean wives be passive. Don't assert your opinions. It doesn't mean tolerate abusive or unreasonable behaviour. So what does it mean? To submit essentially means to yield. In this case, to support the husband in his role in the household. It may mean to submit or lay down our fears, perhaps about trusting someone else, and to choose to trust him. That may be difficult for many people. It needs to go hand in hand with the instruction to husbands. Love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Other translations say, do not be bitter towards them or be gentle to them. It may seem on the surface like husbands get the better end of the deal. But in Ephesians 5, verse 25, Paul tells husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Really think about that for a moment. Jesus died for the church. He sacrificed everything for us and took our sin to the cross in order to make a way for God to forgive us and bring us back to him. We were separated from God because of our sin. Thanks to Jesus' ultimate sacrifice of death for us, and because he rose to life again, we can be redeemed, forgiven, and we can delight in having a relationship with God and look forward to spending eternity with him in heaven. When you think of it like that, I'm not at all sure that husbands do get the better end of the deal. But again, we must note here that this is an instruction to husbands. Wives, this verse isn't for you. What happens if we focus on each other's instructions when they're not addressed to us? This leads to expectation and ultimately disappointment when the other person fails to fulfill our expectation of them, which they will. Nobody is perfect. What happens if we focus on our own instruction? This helps to create harmony, because a husband who follows his own instruction will want to listen to and will deeply respect his wife's opinions. And a wife who pays heed to her instruction will support her husband and help to build him up in his role. It's not an unequal relationship. It's certainly not a dictatorship. Now, I may not be explaining this very well, and you might still be dubious about what I've said so far. So thankfully, I have a story to tell you about a friend of mine, which I think illustrates these verses much better than I can explain them. My friend was at home with her young children one evening while her husband was out. From what I remember, and it's a while since she told me this story, but it stuck with me, one of her young boys was quite agitated and wouldn't go to sleep and just wouldn't settle. She couldn't get him to calm down, and she herself felt that there was something not right with the atmosphere in their house. It felt dark and oppressive. She had this feeling of being under spiritual attack. So she prayed, but nothing changed. This oppressive, dark feeling didn't lift. So she rang her husband. I can't remember what he was doing at the time, but he wasn't far away, and she was able to get in touch with him. And she explained the situation and said to him, I need you to come home. I need you to come home and pray with me. Which he did. He came home and they prayed together. And his feeling of darkness just lifted, and their little boy settled and went off to sleep. And this wasn't because his prayer was more important than hers, or that God listened more to him. God loves all of us and considers us all as equals. But what this story illustrates is the perfect harmony of my friend and her husband working together and supporting each other to fulfill their roles in the family. Together, they made a powerful and formidable spiritual unit. Whatever the devil's schemes at that particular time, when they fulfilled God's instructions to Christian households and they stood together, The devil didn't stand a chance, and he had to flee. Our next verse, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. I told my 13-year-old son I was preaching on this verse, and he was absolutely horrified. It was very amusing. But as with the previous two verses, this verse goes hand in hand with the next verse. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. And this is the pattern with this passage, as we'll see with the next two verses too. Children, obey your parents. Again, the instruction is to children. Can you imagine how all these verses would read if they weren't specifically addressed to the person whose behaviour they're regarding? For example, wives should submit to their husbands. Husbands should love their wives and be gentle with them. Children should obey their parents. Ugh! At best, that would read like a list of inflexible rules. And at worst, it could be interpreted as dictatorial or hierarchical. But God is not promoting a dictatorship. Quite the opposite. He's giving each of us individual instructions which we have a choice to listen to. But if we can heed them and try to put them into practice, this will help us to create harmonious households within which we can support and encourage and build one another up. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Notice that children get an extra encouragement or explanation, for this pleases the Lord. Parents instruct their children and make rules and boundaries which they feel are in their best interests. And right from an early age, children ask, why? Why can't I bash my brother on the head with this brick? Why can't I break all of the eggs on the kitchen floor? When children are little, tired parents who have heard about as many whys as they can cope with sometimes respond with, because I said so. And while that isn't the greatest answer, because children do need to know why they shouldn't run out into the road, for example, you can just about get away with that on occasion, sometimes, when they're very small. Try saying that to a teenager, though. You're not the boss of me. Yes, I am, actually. This conversation does not continue well, trust me. I've tried it. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. The Bible footnotes refer to parents, not just fathers here. Children are instructed to obey their parents, but parents are instructed not to discourage their children by making them bitter or discouraged. How might we avoid making them feel bitter or discouraged? It is right for parents to set rules and boundaries and consequences because we're the adults. We may not be perfect, but we have more life experience and maturity, and we're responsible for our children and their well-being. But children need to feel listened to and to know that their opinions are valued. And as they grow up, they enter this difficult phase where they don't want to feel like they're being treated like children anymore, because their thoughts and knowledge and understanding are no longer childlike. If we treat them like a child and are stern or don't offer explanations, or we don't take time to properly listen to them, or to compromise when compromise might be possible, then we're going to make them resentful, and then they might rebel against us. That's not the harmonious relationship that God wants us to have. If you're not a parent, please pray for patience and wisdom for parents. They need bucket loads. I was once trying to explain to my kids why they should do what I told them, and I pointed out that I was older than their combined years, so I had considerably more life experience. In fact, I'm more than twice their combined years, which is miraculous in itself, given that I'm only 21. Don't know why people are laughing. And they responded with, yes, but we have twice your brain power. Dictatorships aren't good. We see that in the world. Countries who are led by a dictator don't have happy, content populations. God isn't a dictator. He wants us to choose to believe in his Son and to follow him. Jesus isn't a dictator. He is the servant king. He could rightfully lord it over all of us. But instead, he chose to humble himself and take off his crown and come down to earth to live among us. He washed the disciples' feet. He chose to serve others. And we follow him because he is good, and we know and trust that he wants the best for us. Really, today's passage is all about instructing each of us, whatever our role, to have a servant heart, to serve others. Wives, have a servant heart. Husbands, have a servant heart. Children, have a servant heart. Parents, have a servant heart. Put others before yourself. That's not easy, but Jesus did it. He showed us that we can too. Finally, we have instructions to slaves and to masters. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favour, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favouritism. This applies to all of us, whoever we are and whatever we do. Don't just work hard at things when others are watching. Don't be lazy or irresponsible or do things just to impress others. Do it to please God. As Tim said last week when he talked about idols, don't put people or pride or other things above God. He is our master, who we should love to serve. In Galatians 1, verse 10, Paul says, "Am I now seeking the approval of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I was still trying to please men, I would not be a servant of Christ." As well as being a challenge to us, these verses are also encouraging. The flip side is, there's no need to feel demoralised or feel that your efforts are wasted when others don't see how hard you work. God sees. He's pleased with your effort and your faithfulness. I had this on Friday. I worked a 13-hour day and it was absolutely non-stop. I didn't have a break and I only remembered to have a drink of water at around 3 p.m. when I suddenly realised I was really thirsty. Not taking very good care of myself, I know. I was doing telephone calls as well as seeing patients in the surgery. I'm a GP, and trying to sort out reams of administration. And a patient came in to see me later in the afternoon and said, "Oh, you're having a very quiet day." And that was what it looked like from the outside, because at that particular moment, the waiting room was empty. It's easy to feel demoralised when people don't see the hard work that you're doing and the effort that you're putting in. But God sees. When we work hard to serve him, we know that our efforts are always seen and valued and are not in vain. Our final verse, chapter 4, verse 1, "Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven." Those in a position of authority, do not abuse your power. Treat others well. You also have a boss who you serve. He's in heaven and you're accountable to him. And if you have a servant heart towards those you are responsible for, you will be a much better leader. To summarise, all of today's verses are intended to instruct and to guide us in how we should behave towards others. And that is to have a servant heart towards one another. These instructions are given not to dictate to us, but to help us live in harmony with one another. Have a read of this passage sometime and pray about it and think about how these verses might apply to you. What is God saying to you? In doing our best to be faithful and have a servant heart towards others, as Jesus models to us, we can encourage one another and learn to create harmony in our households and in our relationships with others.